for those that are still joining. So we'll be starting in exactly 3 minutes, meaning that at 5 past we should be starting. So if you can be with us a bit for the sake of our other colleagues that are yet to join. Thank you. Colleagues, once again, good morning and welcome to the November edition of the FNSWG meeting. I guess we are meeting at a time when there are so many things happening, ranging from the start of the rains and how, rainfall is performing in a number of areas. I think it's an area of interest. We are meeting at the most strategic time when the new season has just started. So I'm certainly sure that there are going to be a number of topics that are going to generate a lot of interest, especially looking at where we are going into the season. And it also happens that we are now in the lean season. There are a lot of food insecurity issues happening across the region. And I guess these are some of the issues that are also going to come up during this meeting. So I'm certainly sure that we are going to have quite some productive discussions regarding where we are heading to as a region when it comes to food and nutrition security. So let me just greet everyone who is on this call. I'm certainly confident that we are going to have a good time and some progressive time. We're going to discuss key issues. So just running down the agenda for today. We certainly are going to have an update from SADC on climate update, which is where issues around seasonal progress issues are going to be discussed. And then that is going to be followed by some food security updates and agriculture updates from FAO and FuseNet. And FAO will follow up with a situation update on the globe and sub-regional issues. And then UNICEF will give us an update on nutrition, and WFP and FuseNet will give us an update on prices and markets. And as usual, we'll try to open up some few discussions from other partners based on what we are seeing on any new research and assessments that we have. And then we will certainly have a chance to look at our AOB, which is the last agenda of our meeting. And I'm hoping that we are going to stay within the time that we've scheduled this meeting to last. So without wasting much of your time, I'm going to give this time to Tamuka, who is going to take us through an update on climate outlook. So over to you, Tamuka, if you are ready.
Thank you, Godfrey, and good morning, colleagues. Just a quick correction there. I'm not presenting this on behalf of SADC. I think I noted on the agenda that it was the outlook was supposed to be presented by SADC, but I am doing this in my FuseNet capacity. Okay, so please move on to the next slide. So this is coming from the SACO forecast. I think most of you are aware of this, and you probably attended the SACO virtually in August, late August. And what we see from this forecast is basically we've got the OND on the top left. That's October to December, and then November to January in the top right. December to February in the bottom left, and January to March in the bottom right. So this is rainfall forecasts, and what the forecasts are basically giving us. Probably I won't spend much time on this because I'm sure you're all aware or familiar with the output after it was released a couple of months back. But basically, I think things haven't changed that much. We are expecting normal to above normal rains in much of the region, especially the southern and central parts, according to the forecast, and normal to below normal rains in the northern parts of the region. There's also some downscaled forecasts which have been produced by most of the countries. So I think for those of you who are dealing at country level, please feel free to contact the national meteorological agencies who can, if you don't have their national forecast already, they'll be able to share this with you. They'll be more, they'll be downscaled, higher accuracy at spatial level. And I think they'll also be producing updates at a monthly level. I know some of the countries definitely are, like Malawi, for example, are already producing these updates to their forecast monthly. Next slide, please. So the forecast, as you'll see in the next slide, is really typical of our La Nina impacts. And this is basically what's happening currently. The graph on your left is showing you the forecasts for La Nina or El Nino or neutral conditions. When you put them all together, we call it ENSO, which stands for El Nino Southern Oscillation. The oscillation meaning it transitions between the La Nina to El Nino and back and forth over the years. So the blue graph is showing the probability of receiving La Nina or experiencing La Nina conditions, or rather a La Nina event during each of the 3-month periods shown on the map below. We've got OND on the first, that's the first blue graph, the first blue line rather, bar, and then NDJ. So you can see for OND, we've got 100% chance that La Nina will occur. That means the forecasters who produce this are quite confident that La Nina is going to happen during the October, November, December period. We also have NDJ, still quite high odds, DJF and JFM. But I think by the time we get to JFM, the fourth set of bars or from the left. If I don't know if Selam, you're controlling the, you can just highlight this as well on the graph. But by JFM, we're expecting close to a 60% chance of the of La Nina to occur. The gray, what you're seeing on the gray there is the probability of neutral conditions, and then the red is the probability of El Nino conditions. So you can see that throughout our main growing season through to JFM, we've got higher chances of La Nina occurring. And then moving on to February, March, April, which is in the middle of the graph there, you can see that the chances of neutral conditions where we have neither La Nina or El Nino are more likely. So neutral conditions become more likely as we move further into the year. But I think by that time, our season is starting to end, our rainfall season. And then the graph on the right, what's that showing you is, okay, so maybe just to backtrack a little bit, this graph on the left is showing, what is showing is an accumulation of, it's an analysis basically, which is based on looking at different forecast models, which are run out for the remainder of the season until around August, September. These are dynamical models which try and predict how the weather and all its systems will evolve over time. And so this is used as an input into that map on the into that graph on the left. And then there are also some expert knowledge which comes in from the forecasters who have been looking at this and kind of have a sense of how La Nina will develop over time, or El Nino for that matter. So the graph on the right now is showing the models that I was referring to. These are the traces of different models. And when we have a negative negative sea surface temperatures below minus 0.5, you can see most of those graphs, those are basically representing different models. Most of them are below minus 0.5, which shows why that expectation for below normal is, or rather that expectation for La Nina is quite confident, because most of the models are really predicting that by the OND NDJ period will be in a La Nina, well below the La Nina threshold of minus 0.5. Next slide, please. So this is meant to show the, is based on analysis that was done actually by colleagues at FuseNet, NOAA, and University of California, Santa Barbara's Climate Hazard Center. What they did is that they looked at the last La Ninas since I think mid-1950s or so, if I'm not mistaken. And then looking at all those, they looked at when was La Nina most likely result in above normal or below normal rainfall. So the greens they are showing us where above normal rainfall is more likely and when it is according to those months. So for example, if you look at that area around Mozambique, Zimbabwe, Northern South Africa, that's October to March. So around that season, we expect above normal rains. And then in East Africa, and also bordering actually areas around northern Mozambique and parts of Malawi and Tanzania, we are expecting, or rather La Nina tends to be associated with below normal rainfall. But I'd like you to take note of kind of that that area where the kind of around the border of northern Mozambique and northern Malawi. You can see that in that area the association with La Nina changes from below normal rainfall in the northern part of that to above normal rainfall in the southern part of that. And what that means is that there's likely to be greater uncertainty in that area in terms of how La Nina will impact your our rainfall, our seasonal rainfall. It's not a smooth line as you can see on the map there, but this was just tried to generalize, the outcomes that have been observed but it's just worth noting that there is some potentially more uncertainty there because of the evolution of, in fact, the systems associated with the La Nina and El Nino in those areas. Next slide, please. So this is courtesy of Selam, who actually forwarded the presentations to me from the mini forum that was held, I understand, on cyclones. So this is just some screenshots that I got from the presentation by Meteo France La Réunion, which is the recognized expert center, if you like, on cyclone forecasting in the Southwest Indian Ocean. And so these colleagues, from what the presentation is saying, I didn't have the privilege of attending it myself, but just from the graphics, what you can see from there is that they are forecasting that there will be there's a 60% chance for below normal number of cyclones in the Southwest Indian Ocean, which is the ocean basin, or the area that where cyclones that typically affect us originate. And then there's also a 30% chance of a normal number of cyclones. If we look at the notes on the right there, you can see where it says named storms. So the named storms are the ones which typically get higher intensity. So we're expecting at least 6 to 10 named storms, tropical storms, that is, whereas on average, we normally have 10. And then on tropical cyclones as well. So tropical storm is less intense than a tropical cyclone. And so what this forecast seems to be suggesting is that of those named storms that then intensify enough to become tropical cyclones, we're expecting 3 to 5 of those to occur in the Southwest Indian Ocean basin. And on average, we have 5. So you can see that the expected number of storms, tropical storms, the expected number of tropical cyclones is slightly below the average. So I guess that really allows us to associate or gives some explanation of why we're expecting a 60% chance below average number of cyclones. Next slide, please. This again is another slide, as I mentioned. This is from the Meteo France presentation that was provided at this mini forum for cyclone forecasting. So it's a screenshot from their presentation. Full credit to them for that. What I'm seeing here is that in the first half of the season, so I think that's from November to January, what we're seeing from that graphic there, they're expecting, I think the area in blue, where there's that blue dashed, I don't know if you can call it a rectangle, where you can see reduced activity. I think that's the area that is of most concern to us, because these are the populated areas. You can see that from between November and January, the forecasters are expecting a lower number of cyclones, reduced cyclone activity, I should say, whereas enhanced activity is expected in the eastern part of the basin, where it's less populated. But by the time we get to the second half of the season, there is expected to be near normal or above normal cyclone tropical storm activity, again in that western area, which covers Madagascar, Mauritius, Comoros, and Seychelles, and Mozambique, and so on. We do note that I think although the cyclones tend to affect Madagascar and Mozambique most, some of them do sometimes continue moving westwards, and so end up affecting the more inland countries in the hinterland. So it's not just that it's the ocean. It's not just the coastal countries that are affected. But what the forecast is suggesting is that we might have normal to above normal cyclone activity during that period from January up to April. Next slide, please. So this is a summary and key messages from the, again, from the same slide. This is from Meteor France La Reunion. So I think it's basically summarizing what we've just suggested, what we've just been discussing, which is a below normal number of cyclones overall. But in the second half of the season, there is an increased risk of direct impact in the western parts of the region, or well, of the Southwest Indian Ocean basin, including Madagascar, Mozambique, and I suppose also Mauritius, Comoros, and perhaps Seychelles. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is now the evolution of the rainfall season as we have been seeing it so far. We have had above average rains. These actually occurred primarily in the third decade of October. So between around 21 October to around 10 November, we had these above normal rains that were received in most parts of the region, especially I would say rather the southern parts of the region and the central parts. You can see areas like Zambia, Zimbabwe, Botswana, South Africa, and Lesotho, and parts of southern Mozambique and central Madagascar as well. They did receive above normal rains during that time. But at the same time, we had below normal rains, especially in Western Angola. You can see I've put some that dashed oval there, as well as in northeastern Madagascar. So the map on the right there is now showing the rainfall that was received from October up to 10 November, combined with a short-term forecast which ends on 25 November. That's why we're seeing the rainfall going up to 25 November there. And what we're seeing from there is that that dryness is expected to continue in those dashed areas, or maybe even intensify. Next slide, please. So this is what we see when we translate this in terms of the start of season. I'll start with the map on the bottom left. What we're seeing there is the median start of season. When do rains typically start? Enough rains for planting to occur, and we can see there our greens, it's November, our blues is October, purples is September. So we can see, for example, we noted that we had below average rainfall in Western Angola, and by that time we expected that rains should have started by early to mid October. So already that indicates that there's a delayed onset there. But for much of the region, we expect rains to normally start around November or December, as you can see from those colors in green and orange. So if we move on then to the map on the top left, this is now showing the current situation. So we have had rains in the October. We can see the blues there showing October. So we did have a timely onset in the south as well as in the greens. So I think the map of more interest actually is if we move to the map on the top right. This is now showing whether the season was late or early. And those blue colors, they are showing where rainfall was, where the rainfall season was started early. And then so in much of Zambia, central Mozambique, Zimbabwe, eastern Botswana, and parts of Madagascar and South Africa, we had rains have been on time, actually earlier than usual, whereas in some of the northern areas, including parts of DRC and Angola, we had below a late onset. Fortunately, a lot of these areas have received a late onset, but it is a little bit early in the season to be maybe to start worrying about the outcomes because the onset of rains is still ongoing, as we can see what's expected from the map on the bottom left. Next slide, please. So what we're seeing here now is the current conditions in terms of vegetation on the left and in terms of soil moisture on the right. Starting with the map on the left, we can see those areas in blue our normalized difference vegetation index, which is basically a satellite-derived vegetation map, which shows vegetation conditions as compared to average. This is comparing to average conditions. You can see that those above normal rains that we received in late October, early November have led to above average vegetation conditions actually in many of those areas, whereas in the northern parts we are still having below average vegetation conditions. Then the map on the right is kind of saying a slightly similar picture. This is now based on soil moisture, but what we're seeing from there is some of the areas, there might actually have been additional rains in areas like Tanzania. This might have happened a little bit later, but we're seeing some divergence there. So I think in some of these areas, we still need to investigate a little bit further to see why there's that disparity. But the whole idea of comparing more than one image is to allow us to identify those areas where we're quite certain that the conditions are agreeing or disagreeing, in areas such as, for example, Western Angola and Southern Madagascar, where we know that things have been slightly below average. Next slide, please. I think this must be the last slide. Yeah, okay. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Tamuka, for that presentation, which gives us an idea on where we stand when it comes to this much anticipated 2022 to 2023 agricultural season. So colleagues, we've seen it, and also some of the key issues that we need to think about. For instance, the likely picture with cyclones, and also some of the key areas where we kind of see some not so much big concerns, but some, I mean, we need to keep our eyes open on those areas where rainfall hasn't started when we compare to with the normal expected start of the season. So I guess I just want to leave this time for any questions, comments that we may have. So colleagues, it's open. I don't seem to see, I think there's something in the chat box, but to be honest, there's no question there. So if there are any questions, maybe we could show by way of raising our hands or even throwing the questions in the chat box. So the floor is open. We can reflect on what Tamuka has just presented.
Sorry, it's not a question, Godfrey. It might be while the questions are coming in, if there are any. I just forgot to actually mention that the SACOF update is will be held in from 5 to 7 December in Johannesburg. So those of you who would like to get the latest update are free to register and contact organizers and attend, or just wait for the outcomes. Over.
Thanks, Tamuka, for that update. So colleagues, any questions, comments, reflections on the presentation that Tamuka has just provided? I don't seem to see anything at this point in time. No hand raised, and also no comments in the chat box. It's usually tough when you start the day with silence, but I'm certainly sure that as we progress, persons are certainly going to come up. So otherwise, Tamuka, we just want to thank you for the presentation that you made, and the early warning indicators that you have highlighted, which help us to keep monitoring how the season is progressing, and if there are any kind of red lights, we start kind of working on it and start making some analysis on what that means to, I mean, for regional food security. So at this point in time, I'm just going to move on to the second item on the agenda, which is an update on food security, and Imran is going to provide this. So over to you, Imran.
Good morning, everyone. I'll take you through an update on food security for the Southern African region. So if you can move to the next slide, please. So generally, just looking at an overview of the region and building on what we already talked about in our previous meeting, where we talked about an earlier than normal, occurrence of the lean season. Therefore, what we are seeing is there's an increased reliance on staple market purchases, as most of the households already depleted their own stocks and are having to rely on on the markets. So despite some stability in terms of staple prices, I think between September and October, in most of the countries, prices remain significantly above 5-year average and significantly above last year. And we continue to see, conflicts in DRC and Mozambique that are disrupting livelihood activities and driving displacement in Eastern DRC, as well as the Cabo Delgado province of Mozambique. And also because of the worsening macroeconomic conditions across the region, that is severely affecting households' access to stock market purchases. So because of the different factors that we've talked about, we expect some sort of widespread of IPC phase 3, that's crisis in areas of southern Madagascar, Malawi, Mozambique, as well as parts of Angola and much of Zimbabwe, mostly because of the compounding impacts of the poor rainfall in the previous season and tropical cyclones, as well as the downturn in terms of the economic activity or domestic economic declines. So these are the factors that are driving, IPC phase 3 in most of these areas. I'll zero in for a couple of countries just to see how currently the food security situation is, and we'll also look at the projection period. I'll begin with Madagascar. Next slide, please. So as you can see from the graphic, what we are seeing in Madagascar is that there's continued soaring of the annual inflation. We've seen for September, inflation reached around 9.7%, which is one of the highest, probably the highest since January 2018. We haven't seen, that level of increase in terms of the inflation, this is actually eroding, people's purchasing power. And household access to food is actually limited by significantly above average staple prices and below average incomes. I need to mention that this inflation is actually mostly, the increase in inflation is contributed more by the increases in transportation as well as the food prices. So these are the major drivers that are driving the increase in the annual inflation in Madagascar. And in southern Madagascar, there's a typically high dependence on purchases, especially in southwestern areas, mostly due to no meaningful cassava and sweet potato harvest because of the consecutive years of drought, where these parts of the country, I think for the past 7 years, 6 out of these 7 years, rainfall was well below average. And the most recent assessment that was done in September by the Madagascar FNSWG revealed that most of the districts, especially in the southwestern parts, had really no harvest. They experienced a total failure, where about 30% of the population indicated that they had no harvest. So, which means that they were not meaningfully able to break from the lean season of the previous year. And so largely people are mostly dependent on market purchases as well as humanitarian food assistance Although currently the assistance that is going on, it's about half rations that are being distributed to the households. 15 days of food needs are being distributed to these households. Therefore, in the presence of this assistance, we see, most areas in the south, in the Grand South of Madagascar, IPC Phase 3 crisis outcomes being experienced. Just to mention that, according to the current plans in terms of humanitarian assistance, the funding is only up until January. So beyond January, there's no certainty as to what is going to happen in terms of humanitarian assistance in Africa. Next slide, please. So, the season progress to be increased reliance on market purchases, and seasonal income from agricultural labor for very poor and poor households is expected to be below average because of reduced hiring power by better-off households, that are feeling in the impact of increased inflation as well as worsening macroeconomic. And these poorer households are expected to implement coping strategies, including skipping meals and reducing the size of meals that are eaten. And of course, for areas where there is no assistance, we expect that some households might try to migrate to areas where there's humanitarian food assistance. And given that the plans for funding is just only until January, we expect that if this humanitarian assistance doesn't continue beyond January, therefore beyond January, we expect that there could be some emergence of IPC Phase 4 outcomes. Sorry, my connection was lost for some time. So I was saying that beyond January, if the assistance does not continue in southern Madagascar, there's expectation that there could be some emergence of IPC Phase 4 outcomes in some parts of southwestern Madagascar because of the pipeline break in the humanitarian food assistance. Next slide. So moving on to Zimbabwe, the situation in Zimbabwe currently is that the government moved in with a couple of measures that were aimed at containing the steep increase in terms of the exchange rates, the differences between the exchange rate in the official institutions and the parallel markets. And therefore, we've seen that there's some kind of stability. But despite that sort of stability, and I think that sort of led to prices of the major commodities, as you can see in the first graph there, where we're looking at graphs for prices for different commodities in Harare from October 2021 to 2022. We've seen that between I think July and October, there's been some kind of stability in terms of the prices. But despite this stability, the cost of living continues to increase and keeping most goods and services out of the reach of poorer households. And agricultural and non-agricultural labor opportunities and labor rates were below normal, due to below normal harvest from the previous season and crop sales for cash and in-kind payments, but also the sort of instability that was there in terms of the macroeconomics affecting hiring power of the middle and better-off households, also affecting the labor opportunities. There has been also well below average remittances, mostly due to high cost of living and lingering economic impacts of the COVID-19, for countries that usually send remittances to Zimbabwe, and mostly South Africa, and of course in the UK. As already indicated in the regional overview, just like across most of the countries, unproduced cereal stocks are depleted for most households, especially in areas that were greatly impacted by below normal crop production. And that, transportation costs, prolonged power cuts, and an increase in electricity tariffs that was effected as at end of September. There was an increase of 45% in the electricity tariff, and higher prices for alternative sources of energy, among others, are contributing to a continuation of the high cost of production that is also leading to higher prices of goods and services in Zimbabwe. And therefore, given these factors, the worst affected households are having to employ unsustainable consumption-based coping, such as skipping meals and reducing portion sizes, which are leading to widespread IPC crisis outcomes that are typically widespread, especially for areas that are surplus producing areas in the south, east, west, and far north. Next slide, please. As the lean season progresses, we expect increased dependence on market purchases, as indicated. In the most affected areas, households already depleted their stocks. There was an area that normal reliance on market purchases, and also below normal income and above average prices are likely to negatively impact access to food and basic commodities on the market during the lean season. This is eroding households' purchasing power, and therefore poor households are expected to engage in consumption coping strategies. And in typical deficit-producing areas of the south, east, west, and far north, we expect widespread crisis IPC phase 3 outcomes throughout until the end of the lean season in March. And at the peak of the lean season between February and March, we expect that there is likely to be some proportion of households that would experience significant consumption gaps and begin employing more severe livelihood coping strategies, such as sale of productive and other household assets, that would actually culminate into them experiencing emergency IPC phase 4 outcomes. Next slide. Looking at Malawi, one of the issues that are currently driving acute food insecurity in Malawi is continued increase in inflation, where in September, or rather end of October, we saw that the inflation stood at 26.7%, which is the highest in 9 years. This is largely more because of continued increase in food prices, where the food inflation currently stands at 34.5%, and food inflation stands at 18.6%. So as you can see on the graph here, the red line is actually depicting the food inflation, and the blue line is depicting the annual inflation for Malawi. So as you can see, there's continued increase both in the year-on-year headline inflation as well as the food and non-food inflation. Maize prices were trending at levels near 70 to 175% above 5-year average across most of the monitored markets, and they were around 95 to 195%, above last year's prices. Therefore, we see, given that we are, as the lean season progresses, we see that there is increased proportion of households that are heavily dependent on market purchases, and given the soaring inflation, below average incomes, household access to food is limited by reduced purchasing power, and also the worsening macroeconomic situation where we've seen the countries experiencing shortage of forex, currently standing at below 1.5 months import cover, as opposed to the 3 months required import cover. And this has actually led to shortage of fuel across the country, where we've seen there's been a crisis of fuel, and people have had to stand on very long queues, wait for fuel, and on the black market, because of this shortage, fuel on average was actually trending about $5 a liter, up to $5 a liter, because of that situation. And that actually also impacted on the movement of commodities from surplus producing to deficit producing areas. And that's what's also contributing to continued increase in food inflation. Currently, the lean season response plan is now fully funded. You'd recall that in our previous meeting, we had indicated that only around 35% of their lean season response plan was funded. But government moved in, providing the maize that will be required for this assistance, and coupled with the cash that was already sourced. Therefore, the current plan is actually fully funded. Next slide, please. So moving into the projected period, most of the poorer households will be increasingly dependent on markets. And households will likely increase their use of consumption and livelihood-based coping strategies. Therefore, because of the funding, the humanitarian assistance that is expected to be implemented until March would actually prevent worsening of the food security situation in Malawi. Next slide. Also, one of the other countries of focus is Angola, where in parts of Namib, Kunene, and Hula provinces, poor households are experiencing phase 3 outcomes. After facing consecutive poor harvests, depleted food reserves, as well as declining head sizes because of the drought, and the households in those pastoral areas are having to practice destocking, getting rid of the livestock before they actually get sick and die, and then also experiencing limited income opportunities due to the drought. And we expect that until the end of the consumption year, poor households in parts of the Southwest would continue intensifying their typical livelihood strategies than normal due to depletion of their food reserves and significantly below average income from harvesting labor. And income from labor and other livelihood activities are expected to be below average and not sufficient to cover both food and non-food essentials throughout the peak of the lean season, and lower than normal purchasing power will likely affect poor households' access to staple on the market, leading to IPC phase 3 or worse outcomes, especially in parts of the southwestern areas of Angola. And finally, moving on to, I think, Mozambique, where we see that currently, phase 3 outcomes persist, especially in the drought-affected areas of the southern and parts of central Mozambique. As poor households face food consumption gaps, mostly because of limited access to food and income following a below average harvest for the 2021-22 production season. But also in some of the areas, especially in Cabo Delgado, sporadic attacks continue to displace households and limit access to food, as well as income earning opportunities, leading to IPC phase 3. In September, several attacks in Cabo Delgado and neighboring parts of Nampula province were observed, where there was also destruction of infrastructure and houses, causing fatalities. And according to the International Organization on Migration, the tracking matrix, around 34,400 people in Cabo Delgado were registered on the move between August 31 and October 3, citing fear of attacks as well as attacks as one of the reasons these people are actually migrating. And then, in areas where humanitarian food assistance is being implemented, it is actually preventing further deterioration of the food security situation, especially for the areas that are well reachable in Cabo Delgado. Moving into the projection, we expect that phase 3 outcomes are likely to prevail, especially in those areas that experienced the drought. Mostly in the conflict-affected areas where access to humanitarian assistance is limited because of the continued attacks, insecurity. And for areas that are receiving humanitarian assistance in Cabo Delgado, we expect that the humanitarian assistance in these areas would actually prevent worse outcomes, and therefore stressed or phase 2 outcomes are actually expected to be present during the peak of the rain season. So, colleagues, I think this is the update that I had for you. I just wanted to mention that some of the reports for our countries have not yet been published due to some pressure, work pressure. So you see that some of the, the update is actually a repetition of what we had in our previous meeting. But I think that we tried as much as possible to bring in new information and update the meeting on the current food security outcomes. So over to you, Chair.
Thanks very much, Imran, for that update. And colleagues, I guess we can also have some time to reflect on what has been presented and perhaps comparing with what we also see on the ground. And I guess we can engage at that level. So any questions, any comments arising from the presentation that Imran provided? I don't see anything in the chat box, and I guess there are also no hands raised, which suggests for me that we are all fine to proceed. But if it happens that we think about any questions, let's feel free to just share them in the chat box. Colleagues, allow me to hand over this time to Jonathan from FAO, who is going to give us an update on global and regional supply and demand situations. Over to you, Jonathan.
Morning, everybody. Can you hear me well?
Sure, we can hear you quite loud and clear.
Great. Yeah, and thank you for inviting me. I'm Jonathan Pound. I work for those of you who don't know me, I work in FAO based in Rome in the headquarters, and I work in the Global Information Early Warning System. So today I just want to provide a presentation looking at some of the data that we look at on a daily basis, and that's mainly to do with the demand and supply conditions of primary cereal staples. And I want to give you a broad perspective of the global situation, and then look at the same indicators at the regional level, and then the outlooks for the forthcoming year. So if you could go to the next slide, please. Dilan, could you move to the next slide? Thank you. I think you just have to click through maybe 3 times more. So some notes on the right-hand side. And yeah, thank you. There's one more note if you want to click through. So here, what we have, this graph actually shows the global situation for cereals. And it's showing the previous 11 years, and the indicators are, well, the data that we're having, the graph displays are stocks, production, and utilization, which is basically aggregated domestic demand and consumption. As we can see, in the current year, in 2022, 2023, and when I say this cross year, we normally refer to the cross year, the global level, as the July, the 12 months between July and the following June. So this year, as you can see on the green line, we're actually looking or estimating the production of cereals is likely to come down slightly this year, and that's mainly associated with the impact of the war in Ukraine, but also because of adverse weather conditions in some of the key producing countries, for example, within the EU and the US, and they're mainly related to maize and wheat crops, and also rice as well. We're looking at a slightly smaller rice harvest at the global level, and that's associated with small downturns in production in Southern Asia. That being said, actually, we're at the global level, we're forecasting an increase in wheat production this year, and it would put the global outturn of wheat at a record level. So although, we're looking at slightly tighter supplies, it's still a fairly positive situation for wheat. And then just quickly to have a look at stocks. Stocks are likely to fall. And but if we're having a look from a historical perspective, we usually use the stock to use ratio, which basically tries to evaluate the level of stocks against global demand, and that stock to use ratio is forecast to dip marginally in 2022, 2023. But if we're looking at that ratio again from this historical perspective, it's still a comfortable situation. Then, in terms of trade, we're forecasting that global trade would also fall marginally, moderately in 2022, 2023, and that's related to the obvious reasons about the trade disruptions around the Black Sea region, but it also reflects lower export sales from the US and the EU, underpinned by the lower outputs this year. And a small downturn in demand, and that's also partially associated with the slow economic growth that we're seeing across regions this year. So in general, we're seeing like slightly tighter supplies at the global level, but in terms of the supply conditions, it's still relatively comfortable. If you can go to the next slide, please. Sorry, again, you have to click through a couple of times. Thank you. So these are the same indicators, but for Southern Africa. I think the first point we have to perhaps mention is that the region is a net importer of cereals. So this infers that every year, even if we have a large production, normally the countries have to import cereals to meet their consumption needs. And on this basis, we can say that the country is always the cereal markets, the food markets within Southern Africa are continually influenced by the dynamics in the international market. And this is quite important this year, given the situations that we're seeing in the market turmoil that we're seeing at the international level. That being said, I mean, there are some countries that can be net exporters of cereals, and one is Zambia. But not this year, and then also Malawi in terms of maize. They're sometimes a net exporter of maize. But in general, most countries are net importers of wheat and rice, and that kind of drives the import levels during the year. If we look at the current year, 2022, 2023, we see that there has been a decline in production this year. I mean, I don't need to go over the reasons or the areas where the production decreases occurred. But that being said, it came off the back of a record output in the previous year. And that is important because we're estimating that because of this record output, the countries were able to build up stocks, let's say at the national level, the aggregate sub-regional level. And that build up in stocks will we estimate that it lessened the impact of the production shortfall this year, and in essence, kind of curtailed the import demand in 2022, 2023. So yeah, I think that's an important factor to bear in mind, that yeah, the situation, we're seeing tighter supplies, but it could have been much worse, particularly amid the conditions in the international market, if production last year had not been at a record level. But this is at the aggregate sub-regional level. Obviously, there are very diverging trends at the country level. And if we go on to the next slide, please. Lam, could you move on to the next? Thank you. So this graph depicts the changes in import requirements, cereal import requirements, compared to the previous year and compared to the 5-year average. As you can see, in general, that most countries registered some increase in import needs on a yearly basis, and that is the light blue line. But there were a few countries that had like small decreases in their import requirements compared to the previous year. However, yeah, in general, the aggregate, there was an increase in import needs in general, actually, the import needs are actually lower at the aggregate level than the 5-year average. And again, that's just trying to infer that, yeah, the situation is bad, but it's not as bad as it at the international level. So in summary, I mean, across the region, we're seeing slightly higher import needs in 2022, but the import requirements this year have kind of been tempered a little bit by the estimated larger stocks coming from the large record outputs in 2021. But that being said, I just want to make it clear that these are estimated stock levels, and there are a few countries that keep these records, but those stock levels are notoriously, or estimates are notoriously difficult to estimate. And we don't have always very accurate figures to estimate stocks, but these are based on our historical supply and demand accounts that we keep for all countries of the world. And yeah, this data is from official forecasts and estimates from the Ministry of Agriculture and also from the National Statistics Office. So yeah, despite maybe some increases in import needs, but not as much as we were fearing perhaps earlier in the year, we're seeing the import bills across the country, across the sub-region and all countries will increase. And so basically we're seeing a higher cost per unit for imports of cereals. And obviously this is having a big impact on the domestic food market prices. And by that, it's impacting food security conditions. And there are two key reasons for this, and I'll just go over them very briefly, but I think they're quite obvious. If you go to the next slide, please. So the first, oh, sorry, if you go back one, yes. Thank you. So the first reason are the high global food prices. And food prices have actually been increasing since 2021. But as you can see, if you have a look at the black line, which is the FAO Food Price Index, which is like a global barometer of food prices. And it's a combination of several different sub-indexes, including meat, dairy, cereals, oils, and sugar. But if you have a look at the black line, food prices have been increasing since 2021, but there was a sharp uptick in prices following the war in Ukraine. That being said, I mean, in recent months, prices have come down and they've kind of leveled off a little bit. However, that being said, prices are still at elevated levels, and this is having impacts on importing countries. I mean, there are a number of factors that have contributed to the increase, apart from the war in Ukraine, but also in terms of energy prices leading to higher production costs, but adverse weather impacts in some of the main producing countries, as I mentioned before, the US and the EU. Recoveries in some economic performance following the COVID pandemic kind of led to some small boosts in demand. But also, the reactionary trade policies has sometimes influenced the day-to-day, week-to-week movements of prices, putting upward pressure on them if countries impose maybe trade restrictions or there were some trade disruptions. So in general, we're seeing higher global prices, but they have come down in recent months. So that's the first driver of the high prices for importing countries. And then if we can go on to the next slide, please. And so yeah, the second, one of the second key factors that are driving price increases are the currency weaknesses across the sub-region. And so this graph, if you maybe concentrate more on the red dots, this shows the value of the currency against the US dollar and its variation with from in the year to October 2022. As you can see, like most countries have experienced depreciation, currency depreciation, but however, there are some exceptions, including Angola and Zambia. And Angola, yeah, has benefited from an increase in oil revenue because of the higher prices, and Zambia has also, yeah, benefited from some higher global commodity prices and some metals, but also there's been an improvement in the economic conditions, and IMF have re-engaged in the country, so that's stabilized the economy and also helped prop up the exchange rate. But as you can see, for most other countries, there have been depreciations in the exchange rate, and this is also a key driver of the higher import prices that the sub-region is experiencing. As you can see, I mean, there are two, I think, maybe I should highlight, I think there are two countries that perhaps are most concerned. The first is Malawi, where in 2021 they had a depreciation of their currency, and this is followed by a second depreciation, an annual depreciation in 2022 as well. So you can see in Malawi, the yellow dot and the red dot, they're both below, they're both in the negative values. And the other country, which is probably of most concern, is Zimbabwe, where they had, and you can't see the decrease in the year to October 2022 because it's more than 500%. And as I mentioned before, I mean, in the other presentations, this data is official data. So yeah, there's an even greater decrease in the parallel market. So what we're seeing in general, just to summarize, yeah, with where import levels have increased a little bit, but not as much as perhaps, yeah, have increased, but not so much. And that's kind of because of the large output that many countries had, record outputs that many countries had in 2021. However, that being said, despite not huge increases in import needs, there's going to be large increases in import costs. And that's mainly driven by the currency weakness that countries are experiencing this year, and also the high international prices. So maybe if you can go to the next slide, please. Thank you. And yeah, one more. Great. And I just wanted to highlight maybe two areas that have to give maybe attention to in the next year and the coming months. I think the first one is inflationary pressure. I think given what I said previously and the impacts, I think inflationary pressure is likely to be there within the countries until like mid next year, at least until the harvest period. However, in terms of imports, we're likely to see the imports and needs and supply conditions are going to be satisfactory and adequate. So in essence, we're not foreseeing any availability issues, but there will be severe access problems going into 2023. However, there's some slightly mitigating factors that might alleviate some of the pressure in that sense. And the first is that South Africa have a large exportable surplus. Also, Zambia is estimated to have some maize exports available. So there are sufficient supplies within the region, and that helps many importing countries. Then they don't have to look outside of the sub-region to procure the main cereal staple. And also, in terms of Zimbabwe, they lifted the ban on importing a GM crop, so that helps them meet their supply needs. But there are going to be much higher prices in 2022, 2023. Also looking at South Africa as well, their prices, although at higher year-on-year levels, they're actually at the lower end of where they would be, and that's mainly driven by their ample domestic supplies that have kind of kept prices close to the export parity level. So that's on the lower end of where they would be under prevailing circumstances. So despite the high prices, they're not at an excessive level, and that's being driven by the good supply situation in the country. So the next thing is the crop prospects and for 2023 for the crops that are being planted now, and as Tamuka highlighted, we're looking at. I think I mean, on the positive side, there are some very good indications that it's going to be a good season in terms of the impact of above average rainfall, and rains have already started fairly well across the region. So I think that's on the positive side. There's also another positive side in terms of the high crop prices, and that is mainly related to perhaps large-scale farmers. And on the negative side, we're looking at high input prices and perhaps supply disruptions that might limit the availability of fertilizers and perhaps some other inputs into the farming sector. And however, at the same time, the high prices are kind of sustaining some of the profit margins and the large scale farmers and offsetting the impact of the high input prices. But I think there are some early positive signs that we're seeing in the season, just in terms of the area planted. We're still expecting in general that the area planted to cereals with the 2023 crop will be above average. There might be some cutback in areas, but that would mainly be related to perhaps the large scale farmers, just because of the impact of the high input prices. But in South Africa, for example, there's been only a moderate cutback in the maize, in the intentions to plant maize in 2022-2023, related to the high input prices, and some farmers are switching to other crops that use less fertilizer like soybean and sunflower. But in terms of perhaps South Africa being a reference point, it bodes fairly well for the sub-region that South Africa could produce another large crop in 2023, and that would help kind of alleviate the supply pressure and also price pressure. Then the third factor, perhaps, that just needs to be highlighted is the slowdown in economic growth. Obviously, coming from the COVID situation where we had a slowdown in economic growth, and that impacted income levels. At the same time, during that period, prices of foods weren't so high, and so that kind of minimalized the impact of the situation, of the income situation. However, if we're having another slowdown in economic growth and combined with high food prices, it provides like a condition or context where it becomes very worrying for the impact on food security in the sub-region. And then also just to say as well, I think it's important to take note and maybe keep an eye on as well that this kind of slowdown in growth could impact the implementation of agricultural subsidy programs or development programs more broadly. There have been interest rate rises, which helps kind of suppress inflationary pressure, but at the same time increasing borrowing costs, and also the borrowing costs for the governments as well, and that could divert some money away from some of these development or agricultural programs to help service debt, which are quite high, public debts, which are very high across the region. So with that, I can close, and thank you, and happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jonathan, for this informative presentation. Colleagues, if there are any questions, let's engage with Jonathan. Once again, I'm not seeing any questions, any hand raised, and any questions in the chat box. So I guess there are no questions to this effect, and I guess this will allow us to proceed to the next topic. Selam, perhaps to make sure that we kind of keep some level of relatedness on the issues that we are discussing. I would like to suggest that the markets the price and markets update comes first, given its relationship with the presentation that has just been provided. So if you can bring up the presentation by WFP and FuseNet first, and then we then move on to nutrition, I think that will certainly ensure that our discussion is quite connected. So over to you. I guess it's Jones who is presenting, right?
Yes, thank you, Godfrey.
Okay, that's fine.
Can you hear me?
Sure.
Thank you, colleagues. Still good morning, and thanks Imran, Tamuka, and Jonathan for the earlier presentations. My presentation overlaps greatly with what Imran and Jonathan has already presented. Next slide, please. So I'll just be summarizing a lot what Jonathan has been saying in the last few minutes. Yeah, so sorry for that heading there. It's supposed to be key highlights of market conditions. But the conditions, as you've already heard, there is the intensification of geopolitical risks, creating more uncertainties, particularly in the Black Sea region, and disrupting, exports of food commodities, as well as some of the raw materials for fertilizers. There is also general slowdown in the global outlook. Jonathan mentioned this. It's weakening export demand for a lot of our tradables, and the outlook for 2023 is not that great. Inflation levels are also, creeping up. For some countries, they've kind of plateaued, South Africa, Mozambique, but for a number of countries like Malawi, inflation levels are still to peak, and they're eroding wages and spending power, and central governments are having to raise interest rates to curtail these increases in inflation, which further raise the cost of borrowing, particularly for some of our commercial farmers who need to go into production this current season. Weak exchange rates, Jonathan showed those graphs, raising the cost of imported commodities. We still import, fertilizer. We import a lot of wheat, rice. So cost of these commodities are rising because of weak exchange rates. Fuel is still, high. Gas and energy costs are also elevated. There is also the threat of load shedding. I was telling Godfrey, from where I am, there hasn't been power for so many hours, and I'm losing battery power on my laptop. So I can imagine for manufacturers and farmers who need to do their work, there is a lot of disruptions, and costs of alternative power are raising the operation costs. Next slide, please. So I won't dwell much on this. Jonathan showed this graph, that one on the top, showing the main index for this year, 2022. It's closing in on the 2021 index, but still far off from the pre-COVID index levels. But we have enjoyed the decline, the consistent decline since food prices peaked in March. They're still declining. So I won't dwell much on this except to emphasize that there's been some bit of increase in cereals, global cereal prices, but further decreases in vegetable oil, dairy, and other food indices. So some compensation there, which has kept the price index unchanged for October. Next slide, please. Now, in terms of current prices for some of our main cereals, Imran did mention some bit of stability in some, food commodities. The top chart there shows the month-on-month changes plotted on the y-axis, the left axis, and the dots, the orange dots, represent the annual changes plotted on the secondary y-axis, the axis on the right. So those blue bars show the significant increases, month-on-month increases in both maize, rice, as far as Madagascar is concerned, even wheat. Month-on-month prices are not as stable. If you look at Malawi, we looked at a reference market in Malawi called Mitundu. Prices from September increased more than 22%. Yes, the reasons for that were explained by Imran. The macroeconomic conditions are very tough, and costs are high. So the markets are showing that. Some bit of stability in Maputo and Lusaka, thanks to some of the measures government of Mozambique brought in to stabilize markets. The removal of VAT, the controlling of exchange rates. I think that was one of the points Jonathan mentioned for Maputo, for Lusaka, Zambia. The exchange rates have been heavily controlled, and it has helped to stabilize the seasonal movement of prices. But in terms of annual increases, very significant increases, for example, in Malawi, over 150% increase year on year for maize. Even Dar es Salaam, an export nation, increases year on year are over 120%. We know Dar es Salaam, Tanzania had a shortfall in harvest, but Malawi, it's unexpected, but we have seen some of those macroeconomic and exchange rate dynamics, having an impact on markets. We also showed this partial variation in maize prices, as well as wheat and rice for some of the markets in the region. You see prices for maize in Harare among the lowest, just around $200 a ton. This is very difficult to accept in a situation where Zimbabwe had a shortfall in maize production. But key informants are advising us that this is a reflection of a number of things. First, farmers are offloading some of their remaining stocks to get cash to purchase inputs. But for traders, they're still playing a cat and mouse game with authorities. Sales of maize by traders is outlawed in Zimbabwe. So it remains so, I think, for the last 3 or 4 seasons. So traders are having to, do cat and mouse with authorities, inspectors coming to check in their stores, and they are having to dispose of the grain as quickly as they can. We also see very high prices for maize in Goma, reflecting some of the insecurity situation in that area. Imran did mention some of those challenges and how they affect the cost of food. Next slide, please. Here, I just want to share some highlights regarding the prices for fertilizer in the region. We are using South Africa as a reference market. South Africa does do re-exports to some of the countries in the region. So we get to see some of the trends here. Again, apologies for the typos in the heading there. Supposed to be October fertilizer price trends. Here we are looking at prices measured in rands per ton. Again, looking at trends, the monthly movement in prices as well the year-on-year changes. So for urea and MAP, you see that between September and October, prices have kind of decreased despite the depreciation in the rand versus the USD. Prices have also been high year on year, and this has significant impact on production prospects for this current season. But overall, nitrogen fertilizers, urea in particular, prices have been stable, and they've been below the $600 per ton for the first time since July this year. Most buyers are unconcerned about availability at this moment, even though November, December is the peak season for fertilizer demand. Inventories are building up for urea and other products, including ammonium nitrate. The December bids in the Middle East are around 540, 550, which shows this downward trend. For phosphates, prices are again falling. The outlook for phosphate fertilizer prices, MAP, for example, are negative because of weak demand. The sales from some of the major exporters indicate slow sales, but also cutbacks in the US. You remember the hurricane in Florida, damaged some of the one of the plants in Florida. Same scenario in Saudi Arabia. One of their plants is also not active. China has export restrictions on phosphates, but despite all this, demand is weak and prices keep falling. Same for potash. But the other aspect of this is shipping rates have also come down, and this helps in reducing the cost of landed commodities in the region. Shipping costs are low largely because of the reduced demand for shipping into China. The lockdowns are still happening there, and demand for shipping is below normal. But also the reduction in oil prices have translated into lower fuel costs for running these vessels. So shipping rates, shipping costs have come down and helped to reduce the price of imported fertilizer. Next slide, please. This is my last slide. So as Jonathan was discussing, when we look at what we expect with the good start in the rains, there's area expansion expected because the onset has been very good. So farmers have a wide period within which to plant. But there are some commodities that are going to be increased and others that are going to be reduced. There's growing demand for yellow maize, obviously for animal feed. There's also interest to increase the availability, domestic availability of soybeans in South Africa and a number of countries in the region that have been net importers of soy cake for animal feed. And also soybean attracts lower fertilizer costs compared to maize. So when fertilizer prices are this high, farmers would like to produce less maize and produce more soybean to ensure they maintain or improve their net profit. But margins are certainly going to be squeezed because of high input costs. As we mentioned, fertilizer prices are high. For example, in South Africa, the share of fertilizer in the enterprise budget has increased from 35% in 2021 to nearly 50%. So it's going to eat into the margins and the profits for farmers. We mentioned fuel, gas, energy costs are also high, and it makes cost of production prohibitive for farmers. Now, there's a scenario which is building, which suggests that prices in 2023 will largely be declining because farmers in the USA, let's say in the Northern Hemisphere, are going to respond very, very well and increase production, barring, any untoward weather events. We expect a real response because prices are high, global prices are high. Farmers are going to respond. And often when they do that, prices fall. And this is the expectation. Let me just end by a small note to highlight the fertilizer procurement and distribution conditions in our region. As Tamuka mentioned, we have an early start of the rains, and there's been some bit of panic among smallholder farmers who have been receiving subsidized fertilizer. Normally, or even last year, fertilizer was distributed, much later. But we have rains now, and they don't have the seed, they don't have the fertilizer. There's been some bit of panic. Procurement-wise, prices have been high, and this means, more costly budgets for countries, for private firms. So finance has been an issue for some countries to procure the required volumes. And there's also been delays in procurement. So distribution is behind schedule relative to the onset of the rains. So there's been some bit of panic. So we anticipate, yes, seed is available, but fertilizer shortages could be observed as the season unfolds. And that could compromise yields, but that the yield, reduction could also be compensated by increases in area planted. That's all I have for you, colleagues. Over to you, Godfrey.
Thanks, Jones, for that presentation, which, as we can see, it's quite related to what Jonathan also presented earlier. And without wasting much of our time, I'm just going to go straight into questions that we have. I'm worried by our silence today, colleagues. So I hope finally we will have some comments and some questions. I see a hand from Jonathan, if you can give it a shot, please.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks so much for the presentation, Jonas. I'm just wondering, have there been any changes in the distribution programs within the region in terms of like the number of farmers that come under the program, or in terms of the quantity of the subsidized inputs that are being provided? Thank you.
Using the example of Zambia, we know Zambia is one of our net exporters of maize. So they have a significant program of over 400,000 metric tons of fertilizer. So, yeah, the issue is they've maintained targets, but obviously budgets are not completely there, and time is not with the actors. There is some procurement going on right now with fertilizers marooned in Beira and Dar es Salaam, and getting it in country is problematic with these rains. So yes, the targets have been maintained from the 2021 targets in terms of number of farmers, the volumes to be distributed, even the packages, the contribution of farmers, that their co-payment, that has been maintained. But with the rains coming in, the distribution is not going to catch up. Farmers may end up receiving fertilizer that they may not be able to put down. And yeah, they can keep it for next season. But yeah, the impact of the subsidy programs this year with the early onset of the rains is going to be compromised.
Thanks so much, Jones. Much appreciated. And sorry, just to quickly add as well, I wanted to complement what Jones was saying in terms of the reaction by farmers to the high prices. At the global level here in FAO headquarters, I mean, we're seeing already that there is some positive reaction, particularly in Brazil, that the area planted to maize is going to go up quite significantly in 2023. But the Northern Hemisphere countries will only start planting their maize next year. And although there could be some positive response, we're not sure exactly by how much, as Jones was mentioning, just because of the high input costs, and there might be some shifts between crops. So yeah, that will all come to light next year in terms of the planting intentions for maize next year. Thank you so much. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Jonathan, for the addition. Thanks.
All right, colleagues. There's nothing in the chat box, and I don't see any hand raised as well. So I guess we can move on. I'm going to give Irene the chance to present on nutrition update in the region. This is a joint work between UNICEF and WFP. So over to you, Irene.
Godfrey, just checking if everyone can hear me.
Yes, we can hear you. Thanks, Irene.
Right, please. Okay, so I'll start with the regional highlights. Sorry, I'm working from home, so you might hear a little person screaming here and there. Just don't mind. So the region continues to face several shocks, including food insecurity, disease outbreak, persistent conflicts in areas like Cabo Delgado and DRC, and high cost of living. So this continues to negatively affect the nutrition situation in the region. For our nutrition interventions across all the countries in the Southern African region, we are facing a very dire funding situation. For 2022, most countries, on average, have received about 50% of their funding, with some countries receiving only 5% for the nutrition interventions. So the nutrition situation really doesn't look good. And for 2023, the outlook is not positive. So we really need to advocate for nutrition funding for all the countries in the region. In Angola, just to highlight, they conducted a post-harvest food security and nutrition assessment in 13 municipalities in the southern part of Angola. The assessment was conducted and concluded. The report is currently being compiled, and we expect it early December. There is an improved nutrition situation in Madagascar compared to the same period last year. However, the numbers are still very huge, and it is anticipated that there is going to be a deterioration in the nutritional status of the population coming this lean season, which we are currently in from October to March 2023. Over the 9 countries in the Southern African region, we have assisted almost 220,000 children with SAM, which is usually severe acute malnutrition, a quarter to a third of the acute malnutrition caseload. So we have a significantly huge number of children affected by malnutrition in the region. Next slide, please. Next. So I'll go a bit deep dive in certain countries, a few selected countries that I'll deep dive into their nutrition situation. For Angola, we have SAM and MAM treated, supported by UNICEF and WFP. And from January to September 2022, we have screened for almost 450,000 children. About 100,000 children have been admitted with SAM. Of those admitted with SAM, 1,352 children have died in treatment. In 2022, the admissions have increased compared to the same period last year. In Huila, we have MAM treatment, which commenced mid-October 2022, that's this year. And it's just starting up, just picking up. We have screened over 1,000 children, and 136 children were enrolled as of last week into the program. For the nutrition supplies, RUTF, that is the nutritious commodity that we use to treat severe acute malnutrition, we have requested for 44,760 cartons, of which 75% of that has already been utilized in country. The remainder of the supplies that will cover for up to Q1 of next year. Some are still in customs, some are already on ground, and some are expected to be received next year. For the treatment of moderate acute malnutrition, we use RUTF, and that for the year of 2022, we required 445 metric tons, of which we have received already 60% of that in country, and some of it is still in transit, but we expect these supplies to cover the program for the next 6 months. However, as I mentioned in the first slide, we are experiencing a lot of funding gaps, and UNICEF has reported a funding gap of 7.6 million USD. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Hello.
Hi, Irene. It's on the next slide on Madagascar.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, Irene. I think we lost you for just a few seconds.
Okay, all right, that's fine. So where had we finished Angola, or where did you lose me?
You actually completed Angola, and then it was the transition which kind of was disturbed. So I think on course you can move ahead with Madagascar.
For Madagascar, the malnutrition cases currently seem lower compared to the previous time, to the same period last year. But we expect a deterioration into IPC phase 3 of 14 out of 21 districts, according to the August IPC that was held in Madagascar. 480,000 children are projected to be malnourished, with a 20 to 80% ratio for SAM and MAP. There is a mass screening for acute malnutrition that is planned for Q4, which is this month in November, for 11 health districts in the emergency zones. An IPC for acute food insecurity is also planned for this month. Almost 29,000 children have been reached with severe acute malnutrition treatment from January to June, with 2,017 children admitted into the program in the month of September. We still have 11 mobile teams that are implementing nutrition services in the hotspots in the country. 9,000 children were admitted for MAM treatment in the month of September, and about 75,000 children and 12,000 pregnant and lactating women were assisted with nutrition interventions for the prevention of acute malnutrition in the southern part of Madagascar. We also have SWFP, a program that assists patients with TB, and this enrolled 921 patients for the treatment of moderate acute malnutrition in the month of September. Next slide, please. Okay, I'll just continue if you can hear me. So Mozambique, going to Mozambique, in 2022, the nutrition cluster estimated over 336,000 people in need for their 2022 projects. If you look at the slide, the far right bottom section, that's the section that I'm talking about. In 2023, if you look at it, there is going to be a significant increase in the number of people in need, from 300,000 to 512,000. And of that, the nutrition cluster aims to target 65% of those people in need. For 2022, the funding for HRP, Mozambique managed to secure 50% of their funding needs, and they've only managed to reach 48% of their target 2022 beneficiaries. 14 partners are implementing nutrition activities in the country, which include 2 UN agencies, WFP and UNICEF, 4 local NGOs, and 8 international NGOs. Now to the situation, the nutritional situation in the country. There's an increase by 46% in some admissions in Q3 of this year. And from January to October, we have enrolled 36,000 children with SAM and 49,000 children with MAM. There's an ongoing IPC. Results will be released by end of this year. 20,000 cartons of RUTF are in Cabo Delgado available for the next 6 months for some treatment. WFP is also implementing MAM treatment in 7. Next slide, please. Yes. In 3 northern provinces, which translates to 260 health centers. So for the MAM treatment, from January to October, we have managed to reach 25,000 children, that is children 6 to 59 months, and pregnant and lactating mothers, 17,000. We also provide supplementary feeding for children under 5 in Cabo Delgado for the prevention of acute malnutrition. Integrated mobile brigades are still active in 3 provinces, where we also provide treatment of pregnant and lactating mothers and children under 5. There is also a dissemination integrating into all the nutrition programs of SBCC messages. In particular, we have one for a nutrition sensitive project, which we call NutriSim campaign, which basically means say yes to nutrition in Cabo Delgado. And there is also an intervention for HIV and AIDS patients, which has not been ongoing due to funding constraints. The funding ended in March 2022. So currently, the nutrition cluster, WFP and UNICEF, are formulating a joint call to action to address the funding situation in the country. It has been dire for quite time now. So there's a call for action that is being finalized, which is appealing for 25 million for their HRP for next year, that is 2023. For the supplies, UNICEF supplies, that is the RUTF, are in stock and will cover treatment for the next 6 months. For treatment of MAM, we only have supplies up to March 2023. And for the prevention of acute malnutrition, supplies are available until February 2023. So funding is really critical to cover these pipeline gaps before they happen and not to discontinue any services. Next slide, please. All right. Then we go to Malawi. Overall, just like the previous countries, we are seeing an increase in the number of either people in need or people who are being moved to worse phases of the IPC. Malawi is not spared. From June to September, it was projected that 13% of the population would be in IPC 3. But for October to March, it is increased to 3.8 million people, which is about 20% of the population. So there's a 7% increase of people in IPC 3. The number of districts have also increased. Previously, there were 6. Now they're going to be 21 in the period of October to March 2023. The causes are one which is the most affecting is because we are now in the lean season. So we anticipate more cases of food insecurity, which will translate to malnutrition. Also, climate shocks have affected them. Food shortages, high prices of inputs, and the Ukraine war affecting the farming seasons. 24% of some admissions have increased comparing the same time to last year. The country has supported UNICEF, WFP, and FAO are supporting the national multisectoral nutrition policy that is being reviewed currently. WFP is also supporting the local production of nutrient-dense food, that is the specialized nutritious foods in the country. Next slide, please. Next. Yes, Namibia also is seeing an increase in the number of admissions for both severe acute malnutrition and moderate acute malnutrition compared to the same period last year. The National Integrated Immunization Campaign just concluded, and the report, we still await for the report, but for the preliminary results, the coverage was good. 85% of the children received vitamin A supplementation, were vaccinated for measles, and received deworming. IPC 2022 was completed, and the report is under review. In Ohangwena region, WFP I'm back.
Hi, Irene.
Hello. Yes, I'm back, right?
Okay, that's fine. And our time is also on the red. If you can please try to wind up.
So let me wind up with Namibia and go to DRC. So in Ohangwena region, Ministry of Health and its partners conducted a campaign for the 1,000 days, that is from conception to 2 years of age, supporting infant feeding practices, maternal nutrition, food preservation, food safety, and hygiene in the communities, and disseminating some social behavior change messages. So I'm going to skip Zambia, but the presentation will be shared for people to review Zambia and Zimbabwe and Eswatini. I'll go to DRC. Yes. So the nutrition situation in DRC remains fragile. Conflicts still persist in the eastern part of the country. And recently in August, September, there were conflicts in the western side, which is highly unlikely, but there was conflict in the western side, which displaced 35,000 people, and these people will require assistance. The conflict continues to affect access of humanitarian agencies to assist the most people in need. Inflation in the country is reported to also be on the rise, with the general food distribution food basket increasing in the recent months by 25%. For the nutrition updates, in the first semester of the year, WFP has assisted almost 600,000 children for the treatment of MAM, and supported 2,500 caretakers with food while they are waiting for treatment for their children in inpatient care, children with severe acute malnutrition. who are enrolled into the health facility and admitted into the health facility. Prevention of acute malnutrition program has also reached almost 260,000 children and has assisted over 107,000 pregnant lactating mothers. So that is all from my side. There is also information on Zimbabwe, the Republic of Congo, Eswatini, and Zambia. That is on the slides that people can go through. Thank you. If there are any questions.
Thanks, Irene. And we are so sorry that because of time you couldn't do those other slides, but colleagues, you definitely received the full slides with other countries that could not be shared because of our time. And colleagues, any comments, reflections on what our nutrition colleagues have just shared?
Hello, Godfrey.
Hi, Irene, I can hear you. I don't seem to see any questions in the chat box and also no hands raised. So it's of course scaring that usually we have quite a lot of questions and we are usually very active. But today it looks like it has been quite a silent day, and I'm hoping that perhaps next time we'll be more active. Otherwise, thank you very much, Irene, for that presentation, and we'll definitely share the slides for everyone's consumption. So I think we are done with all the key agenda items that we had. And in the best interest of my time, I'm not going to be able to provide any time for partners to come in. We are so sorry that I think we had a heavy agenda. We'll try to make sure that in the next meeting we kind of leave space for those discussions from partners. Unfortunately, today we can't do it because of our time. I really want to ask us to keep as much as possible closer to 12. So on the AOB, the only AOB that I have is to just remind us that we still have our agenda on the work planning session for the FNSWG. And we are hoping instead of January to have it in February. The reason is that we noticed that usually in January, people come back from holiday and it's a very tight schedule. There are tight deadlines, there are tight deliverables that have to go. And because of that, we thought maybe February might be slightly better and flexible for a number of us. So my apologies, we are having to plan this for February. We'll give you more details on how that is going to go, but otherwise we are going to share a date with February in mind, not January, because we don't want to clash with other busy schedules that are known to come in January. That's the only AOB that I had. I don't know from the team if there's any other AOB item that you may be having from partners, from any one of us. All right, it does look like that's all that we have. Once again, I just want to thank you